Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show... So, Brien Foerster, welcome to Windows on the World.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Well, you've been on the show several times, and we've talked in quite some depth about ancient megalithic culture. But you've been doing quite a lot of travelling recently. You have your hidden Inca tours, which go to all of these megalithic sites. But you've been travelling to different destinations, including Baalbek. Have you come up with any other insights into what you're seeing?
Well, yeah, we were invited for our third annual techno-spiritual tour of Egypt in March, and so prior to that we spent a week exploring ancient sites in Mexico, mainly of the Toltec, Aztec, and a little bit of the Olmec people. Then we had our 2.5-week tour in Egypt, and then after that we spent 4 days in Baalbek in Lebanon.
Now, Baalbek is a fascinating place, and I do intend to visit there one day. What was your impression when you saw the stones?
I was just completely in shock. It's, again, like anything, it's one thing to see photographs or even video of something, but to be there in real life is completely different and much more profound. For those, and most people, of course, haven't been to Lebanon, but Lebanon's a beautiful little country to which we plan to go back at least once a year. And Baalbek is located about 2.5 hours drive from Beirut, which of course is on the Mediterranean. So you go up high, actually even to the snow level, leaving Beirut, and then down into the Bekaa Valley. And beforehand, I thought that the Bekaa Valley would be some kind of desert, eroded landscape, but it's an incredible farming agricultural area that seems to be able to grow food year-round. And in general, or quite often, where you find a megalithic site, you also find the presence of either ancient or modern-day agriculture on a huge scale, like in Peru. So Baalbek is that kind of thing. It's right in the middle of massive farmland. The first place we went to was the quarry, and you have to see the quarry as well as Baalbek, because the two of them, of course, are interlinked. The quarry is about a mile away from the Baalbek site, and there we found two massive stones still in place, each weighing about 1,200 tons.
And of course you've got what I think researchers like Eric von Daniken originally stated was some kind of landing base, which is all of these megalithic stones put together into a structure which is quite breathtaking to look at. And you've got this huge stone kind of enigmatically left in the middle of kind of nowhere. Can you just describe the site a bit for us?
Yeah, well, it's really important to go to the quarry, because that's where you're looking for how the stone was actually shaped, like what tools were used to try to cut something of that scale. And again, we are talking 1,200 tons. There are two stones there. One of them was cut already from the side of the quarry itself, from the sheer bedrock, and tumbled down, and is lying there with all sorts of other cut marks in it, because later people such as the Romans came and tried to quarry that stone, since it was, easily accessible. But the large one, called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, which is kind of a corny name for it, but it's still attached to the bedrock. So it was never finished. It was never separated. And then when you go to Baalbek, which you can see from the quarry, I think what you're finding there, or what we found, is that whoever was initially constructing Baalbek abandoned the project before they finished it. And I think that's evidenced by this massive 1,200-ton block, which is still in place. Much later, the Romans show up and they find the site, and then they build all sorts of constructions on top of this initial foundation. And even our tour guide, who was Lebanese, was sure 100% that the Romans had done all the work. And we just looked at it and said, no, this, the foundation would be almost impossible to do today. So how could the Romans do this kind of work with, rollers and pulleys and things?
Exactly, and if you look at Roman settlements, they are pretty uniform in what they look like. They had a certain building style, and that doesn't really compare to what's in Baalbek, does it?
No, and again, you're almost always given a rather childish explanation in these places, and that's the standard, the standard historical story. They reason that why Baalbek contains these 1,200-ton blocks, of which there are at least 3 in alignment in the so-called Temple of Jupiter area, as well as numerous 400-ton blocks and many more 100-ton blocks, is that the Romans wanted to show off their building prowess to the local people, and yet they never attempted to do the same kind of thing in Rome itself. So that's, I think, kind of quite a corny argument. Whereas it makes a lot more sense that somebody long before the Romans were attempting to build something on a huge scale and for some reason abandoned the site. And later the Romans came and built on top.
It's very interesting when we look at this because the Romans seem to build over the top of quite a lot of things, and even in this country on some ancient sites I've been looking at, Roman settlements were built over pre-existing settlements, so that's obviously quite a common thing. As far as the history of Baalbek goes, for people who aren't quite aware of it or haven't really looked into it, can you give us a bit of the history of Baalbek as far as it goes into the history of Canaan?
No, that's a really good point. I believe the Romans were supposed to be there somewhere, roughly 100 BC to 100 AD kind of time period, or possibly even later on. But the people who lived in the area, or the dominant culture before that, were the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, of course, were the ones who were slaughtered by the moving in of very early Jewish settlers in the Holy Land, in Israel area. But the Canaanites, I think, to some degree, are quite obscure in that, there's a lot of factual evidence about who they were. But then when you get into the more esoteric and biblical aspects, then you get into the idea of the Nephilim, who were the sort of hybrids, the fallen angels concept. And even though that may sound like something which is a fairy tale or a quasi-historical subject, the fact that you have these monstrous stones that could barely be worked on and moved today were obviously worked on thousands of years ago. It means that we're missing a major aspect of history in that area. And Baalbek is a place where, like many sites that are enigmatic, such as Tiwanaku, you can't visit them once and get much of an understanding. You have to make repetitive trips, and that's what we plan to do, at least one trip a year to look more in a more focused way at Baalbek. And the tool marks that we found, the terrain, like it's not simply that these massive blocks were simply dragged across the ground. They had to be taken out of the quarry vertically and then moved horizontally. And there's no reason why they had to build the Temple of Jupiter with stones of that scale in terms of engineering or construction strength. They just seem to have the capability of working with the largest megalithic blocks that have been found so far.
I think there's some kind of contradiction in the story of who the Canaanites were, in the respect that biblically they're represented as quite degenerate, with child sacrifices to Moloch and very, very bad reputation. Even Jesus is alleged to have basically not wanted to help a dying Canaanite woman. He originally said he wouldn't help her, and then he came to her rescue in the end. So they're presented as quite a barbaric and degenerate race. But that seems to be very contradictory when you look at this ability to move these massive stones. That seems to indicate some kind of advanced knowledge.
Well, very much so. And then I've only read a little about it so far, but when you look at who, the so-called god Baal, from which, for which Baalbek was named, it seems very much that Baalbek or Baal was originally a god or deity of fertility, and makes sense in a location like the Baca Valley, which is agricultural, that some kind of temple would be made to him. But then you have this historic battle that went on between the followers of Baal and the followers of El. And I think it's El eventually wins the influence over the people, and then history is rewritten by the followers of El. And that's, I think, when you get the whole idea that Baal, demanded human sacrifice and children being thrown into, a fiery pit and whatever. So I'm going to have to do a lot more reading about it. But it's very common, of course, in historical stories where history is rewritten or written by the victor, and I think Baal is a victim of that. It's very controversial, but initially I believe Baal was, simply was some deity of fertility, and then was demonized by the next dominating culture that moved in, who were following a different high deity.
Well, that does tie into the historical record. If you look at any wiped out or ancient civilization and the civilization that comes in after it, this even goes to the Romans, who would just chop the heads off the preceding statues, of the rulers. So it's quite puzzling, but I think that is the main contradiction, in that you've got this way that they're portrayed very barbarically and ungodly, but in the respect that they're presented as basically pagan kind of child killers, So, yeah, that's a very interesting one.
Yeah, and that is very common. The whole history of the Inca in Peru as well. Most of the work that was written about them by the conquering Spanish. Again, the history was rewritten in that the Inca were described as being heavily involved in human sacrifice, etc. And almost all of that, almost 100% of that, was made up by the conquering people and the Catholic Church in order to make the descendants of the Inca people feel terrible about their history, and therefore it made it much easier to program them. But of course, I'm living in Peru, and the Inca are one of my specialties. And from what I've been finding out, the Inca were not that way at all. Human sacrifice was incredibly rarely performed, and they were a much more peace-loving and diplomatic people than most historic records state.
This is interesting, as it brings us into the Watchers and the Nephilim and the giants. And although many people may not see the connection, I don't think you can discuss this part of the world without bringing that in. And it's something you've looked into. How do you think it ties in, if at all, in that Mount Hermon is there, right on the Syria-Lebanon border, which is where the Watchers were meant to have descended?
Well, exactly, and we saw, as we were driving to Baalbek, you see Mount Hermon on the right side in the distance, all covered in snow. So again, since I've only been to Baalbek once, I don't know as much about it as I should, or about the Watchers or the Nephilim yet. But because I'm so fascinated by Baalbek, I clearly, will be doing much more reading up on this whole bigger topic, because like anywhere I visit, I really want to get down to the fundamental understanding of who did this monumental work, when, and you have to cut through a lot of the rewritten accounts to get to the core of the original story, such as I just described about with the Inca, for example, or in Egypt with all the monumental works that have been found in Egypt, that some of which clearly the dynastic Egyptians didn't construct. So again, you have to deconstruct history in order to find out the reality of what actually happened.
Yes, and in the case of Baalbek, why would you use stones that size when it could have been constructed much more easily, for humans anyway, with much smaller blocks?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It's another one of these amazing jigsaw places. The same in Egypt, the same in Bolivia, the same in Peru, and the same in some other locations, where you have this really messy mix of construction technique. And that's why it's wonderful when we have people who are stonemasons or contractors or engineers come with us and look at these things, and they almost instantaneously see that there's a real, that obviously these were not built in one go by the same people over a short or even long time frame, because in all the countries I've mentioned, you find profound foundation work of incredible precision, and then much poorer construction later on top of it.
Yes, you've got the advantage of being able to compare these sites, because you've made that point about these sites in Peru, that you get the Inca, the Spanish, and the megalithic, and they are so different. So the further we go back, the bigger the stones are. So really, that may indicate that the creatures that put them there were bigger than us. That would make sense, in my opinion.
It's possible, but also the term giant could not necessarily refer to someone of great physical stature, but someone of great mental prowess, or possibly a combination of both. But we're clearly looking at people, or you could say beings, with capabilities far beyond what is conventionally thought of these areas, and very difficult, if not impossible, for us in the 21st century to be able to do.
I think that's a really good point, because we're not just really talking about giant stature, we're talking about giant intelligence. And I think that is something that I've found extremely fascinating, because when you're dealing with these sites, and even the sites in the UK with these cromlechs, which are always described as burial chambers when they're clearly not. There's one I looked at recently with a 25-ton piece of stone on top. Now, this is very near a Roman settlement which was built over a pre-existing site which is described as an ancient farming community. So this is the problem, though, isn't it? That the further we go back, the less we know. And there's all these assumptions made. But that kind of brings us in to another area of your research, as far as possible bigger brain species go, with the Paracas people, who a percentage of seem to have had these elongated skulls. Do you think that ties in with this worldwide megalithic culture?
It could. It's my latest book, which is the Elongated Skulls of Peru and Bolivia, and the subtitle is The Path of Viracocha. What I do in that book, after years of looking, physically at the sites and the skulls, is to document geographically and chronologically where you have these elongated skulls, specifically in Peru and Bolivia. The book that David Childress and I wrote before that was more of a global and to some degree superficial examination of it, but I wanted to focus on Peru and Bolivia. And what we find is a very strong correlation between megalithic sites and the presence of elongated skulls. And they're almost all of them are located on what is called the Path of Viracocha, which is an energetic line, as well as the major Inca road in the highlands of Peru travels right along what this Path of Viracocha is. And to give you just a basic understanding of it, it starts at the border of Peru and Ecuador in the north of Peru, and then travels in a southeasterly direction, almost 30 to 45 degrees, right down through many megalithic sites that people will have heard of, such as Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, Sacsayhuaman, Tiwanaku, the Island of the Sun, etc., etc. And at all of those locations, elongated skulls have been found.
This is really fascinating because this ties in with the curated artifacts of Klaus Dohner, and we had him on the show quite a while ago, but that presentation of these anomalous artifacts and indeed giant bones really does indicate that to me a lot of this stuff seems to have been deliberately written out of history or kept secret, because he shows a pyramid which he said could be, I think, between 8 to 13,000 years old, with the 13 steps on of brickwork and the all-seeing eye, which is now on the American dollar. But if there's a section of, or certain people on this planet who are using this symbolism, which is beyond ancient in relative history, then do you think there are people on this planet who are aware of maybe this genetic modification or the real origins of Homo sapiens sapiens, which may have been hidden from us? Have you got any ideas or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in most cases, the megalithic sites themselves predate what we call history. And that's the biggest problem that a lot of historians don't even bother grappling with. They just ignore the fact that we're looking at megalithic sites in Egypt, Bolivia, Peru, and Lebanon, which could be far older than 5.5 to 6,000 years ago, which is when supposedly civilization began in some of these locations. In the case of the Inca, of course, it's the Inca found their capital, Cusco, as more or less an assemblage of primitive huts, and then they built their fantastic city on top of it. But there are megalithic aspects to that which I think the Inca found. So that's the most simple answer to it is we are looking at locations which are older than what conventional history says they are. And as regards human beings, we don't fully know the history of humanity. A lot of the, especially Darwinian viewpoint has a lot of gaps and missing time frames and supposition involved. And thankfully, in modern times, subspecies of humanity have been found in relatively small numbers, such as the Denisovan, the little tiny almost dwarf-like people who have been found on the I think it's on the Flores Island in Indonesia, and then other anomalous humanoid artifacts are starting to show up. And so I think, getting back to the Paracas people, I think the Paracas were actually a relatively small group of people who traveled to the coast of Peru from another part of the world, possibly to escape persecution. They found the Paracas area to be, which is where I am now, a beautiful environment. Very few human beings were populating the area, so they were able to establish themselves here and develop civilization quite rapidly based on all of the knowledge that they brought with them. And we're starting to suspect that they may have come originally from the Middle East.
That's very interesting, which ties in with a characteristic of these people. They had, I believe, auburn or reddish hair.
Yes, and we are in the process, as well as the DNA testing that we are in the process of doing. The red hair samples, which is an auburn red, not an Irish or Scottish red. It's a very dark fire red. Samples of the Paracas hair we're hoping to send to the world expert on ancient hominid hair in the United States to see if it is, we suspect that it's genetically red, and he'll be able to prove that. And if that is the case, then clearly the idea that all the people who have ever populated the Americas came across the Bering Land Bridge and are 100% Native American of Eastern Asiatic origin is wrong. Also, there are dental features of the Paracas which tie them closer into people of China, Japan, and possibly Korea from the distant past. And a lot of other characteristics that we're starting to be able to identify, and through limited at this point channels, be able to find experts who can look at this evidence and see that we have a growing volume of information that seems to make the Paracas a distinctive people or possibly subspecies of Homo sapiens sapiens who were not initially 100% Native American people.
Yes, I think this is a very important point as well, and it's a point that you've made, because in your research and visiting museums, there seems to be many variations of the species of Homo sapiens, or possibly they are different species because the skulls are slightly different. The skulls even on display that you've shown, we've seen very different types of skulls, and these aren't all due to cradle boarding, are they?
No, the majority are the result of artificial cranial deformation as a spiritual cultural practice. And again, that's why I wrote the book that I have just published, because I wanted to look at all of the different shapes and geographical distribution. And the most intriguing ones by far are the Paracas skulls. Most of the ones in the highlands of Peru are clearly the example of cranial deformation of some kind, of the elite members of society. But the Paracas are the largest and in some cases most natural looking. Some of them are so complex in shape that it would be very difficult to believe that they are the result of cranial deformation. They appear to have originally looked like they, stem from a conehead type people.
Yes, and you've also pointed out that these particular skulls have 2 parietal plates rather than 3 on the skull, which is what we have. They have bigger eye sockets and fewer molars. Is that right? Yeah,
the sagittal suture, which is the one that runs this way that we all have, in the most, the characteristics of what I would call the natural-looking Paracas skulls are manyfold, because they all lack this suture line. It's not that it's partially there; it just doesn't exist. Another thing is the fact that their eye sockets are much larger than ours. They have 2 small holes in the back of the skull here, which is or was for nerve and blood flow to come out. So that's a genetic characteristic of these people. Highly uncommon in quote-unquote normal people, but in every single Paracas elongated skull, you have these 2 holes. You have a massive jaw. You also have, I can't remember the name of the bone that comes down here, but it's almost like a horn shape that comes down here, and that's where muscle attachment is to a major degree, and it's very, very large on these Paracas skulls. And I believe that the reasoning for that is that because the skulls were in some cases quite a lot bigger and of a different shape than ours, that the muscle structure had to be much more robust in order to be able for these people to hold their heads, literally hold their heads up properly.
Yes, and their physical stature is slightly bigger. Were their bones actually thicker as well than ours? Is this something you've looked into?
No, not yet. The problem with trying to study the skeletons themselves is that often the skulls are found separate, because in general the skulls are found as the result of what would you call it, recovery of artifacts from tomb robbing that is still done to this day. And so in general, the skulls are not regarded as something that the tomb robbers want. They're after textiles and gold and silver artifacts. And often the skull is found separate from the body itself, and the bodies are usually literally torn to pieces anyway, because there could be a gold necklace or a ring or something inside the cavity of the dead person. Usually the tomb robbers are relatively simple-minded farmers who don't know much about human anatomy or even history that much. So they literally tear these ancient people apart looking for whatever they can find. But the study of the skeleton is one of the next major phases, to see what anomalies there are, not necessarily with normal humans, but with other people that lived in the area.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Could you just describe the landscape of this Paracas Peninsula where these people lived?
Sure. My latest video, I was actually able to use my quadcopter with high definition camera and film a fair amount of the Paracas area. And initially, what the video shows is the landscape is incredibly desolate. There is a lot of salt in the sand of the area because it's an ancient uplifted ocean. And so it wouldn't, you would think it wouldn't be a place that anybody would want to live. But when you take into account the abundance of the ocean in this area, which is, I believe, possibly the most productive ocean area in the world in terms of food production, it would have been perfect for an intelligent society as a place to live. And also, water comes down underground from the Andes and eventually makes it into the sea. But there are vast areas of massive agriculture that sustains production 12 months of the year because of the climate. So it would have been a place 2,000 plus years ago of amazing marine and also terrestrial productivity. So it would have allowed a people to live here with quite ease and with a lot of actually time on their hands, because of the abundance of food. And so I think an intelligent people possibly escaping from persecution, or maybe on the quest of adventure, once they reach the Paracas Peninsula, which is also the largest natural protected bay on the coast of Peru, they would have said, this is where we will rebuild ourselves in peace from those that possibly were persecuting us, and also because almost no one was living there in an established way at the time of their arrival.
Yes, and as far as them being different, the process of cradle boarding is actually basically a copy, a species or ancestry of what could be considered or stated as some kind of royal caste. How do you think that ties in the respect of they appear in this place, which is perfect for them to live, which has everything they need? So what do you think is the possibility this whole thing was a kind of planned that they would migrate there? And if they did, where did they come from? Have you got any ideas where they actually came from, if they indeed did migrate into that place?
Well, we're still piecing this together, but auburn red hair originates in the Middle East, in the Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan area. And I believe that genetically, I'm supposing on this until we get the DNA results, but I believe that's where they very well could have come from. It could have been localized climate change in their area too, that could have caused them to have to leave. They may have actually simply followed the winds and currents, because they could have found, without too much difficulty, the Red Sea, and then from the the Persian Gulf, and then from there entered the main ocean area. And if you look at winds and currents, if they were the same 3,000 years ago as they are today, then it wouldn't have been that difficult for them to be able to simply sail over the course of possibly a long period of time, but eastwards, and finally make their way to the coast of Peru, and then decide that was where they wanted to establish themselves.
That would make complete sense if you look at the area geographically. Now, you've also described that there may have been cemeteries for royalty in this Paracas region. Can you just go into that?
Yeah, definitely. The great thing is that I'm obviously not a trained archaeologist, but I've been taught by Senior Juan Navarro, who is the world expert on this area. He's been studying the Paracas and other cultures of this area for many decades. And he's taught me how to identify the ceramics of the different cultures. So it's quite easy to distinguish between the Inca, who were the last civilization here, and the earlier cultures, the Chincha, the Wari, the Nazca, and the Paracas. So wherever you find specifically Paracas pottery with adornments on them, that's where you also find the elongated skulls. And like any culture in the world, it was the nobility that would have had the finest textiles, the finest jewelry, and the finest ceramics. And so you specifically find that the elongated skull Paracas were buried in we identified four major cemeteries that are exclusively elongated skull people. And in each case, you find fabulous adornments and ceramics and textiles buried with them. And the largest elongated skulls are all found in one cemetery called Chongos, where you also find the remains of several adobe pyramids in the desert, but right on the border of incredibly productive agricultural land. And the view from this cemetery is the Pacific Ocean. So you can tell that these people had a sense of aesthetics, and also they wanted, in each case, in terms of these ancient burials, they always face the ocean. So I think it's not only the fact that they were maritime fishing people of the area. I think to some degree they were, on purpose, they had their cemeteries facing the Pacific and facing west, possibly looking towards their original homeland.
So they had quite an idea of aesthetics. They were very much into producing high quality jewelry and artifacts, but is there any kind of trace of any written history of these people?
No, there isn't. And I don't think we'll find anything in regards to that. I'm still, because Peru has such a complex history, I have found out recently that the Inca language called Runasimi, which some people call Quechua, its origins are actually on the coast. And so it's believed that thousands of years before the Inca existed, that the Paracas were the originators, or brought with them the original Runasimi language. And the Paracas did die out 2,000 years ago, leaving no direct inheritors. But because the Inca spoke possibly the same language, or a dialect of the same language, I'll have to get in contact with language experts and see if there are any languages in the Middle Eastern area which could be related to the Runasimi. We know there are Polynesian phonetic connections, but whether there are Middle Eastern connections, I'm not sure yet.
Have you got any ideas why there might not be any written record of the Paracas?
No, it's very curious. You would automatically think that they would be a very unsophisticated people if they didn't have a written language. But of course, the same thing has been said about the Inca, which is completely not true. Standard story about from any National Geographic special is these people without the wheel or a written language, were able to do this. But in the case of the Inca did have a concept of the wheel, and they had three forms of written code language, not letters like we have, but hieroglyphic style. But amongst I've been looking for stuff like that among the Paracas, but so far not been able to find anything that directly connects or is similar to the way the Inca had a coded language.
Do you think this is because that they were deliberately wiped out of history, or could it possibly be that they were mainly an oral culture?
I'm tending to believe that they were an oral culture, and I don't think an oral culture is less sophisticated than having a written culture, because if you have an oral tradition, it means that the knowledge itself is held by experts and probably few in number. And when you pass on important information about your culture, it has to be done in a pure manner. And oral tradition in that way is very sophisticated as compared to when you write something down, you can make mistakes. But in terms of oral tradition, the student has to learn the history in a very specific and pure manner, because the teacher is constantly questioning the student, repeat this back to me. And if the student makes a mistake, then the teacher corrects it. So on some levels, oral traditions are meant to be a way to control knowledge, to make sure that the general population doesn't necessarily learn things that they don't need to know.
That's a very good point, because the ancient Celtic laws were originally, I believe, spoken. Now, when you put laws or history onto paper, they can easily be changed. So I think that's a very good, important point, and it actually suggests a higher intelligence for an oral culture. I would suggest that to be the case, because if it can only be spoken, then lies would be much more obvious.
Exactly, and having a written language is actually kind of a lazy way of recording things, because if you have it written down, then you can forget it and then pick up the piece of paper and look at it. But in an oral culture, the only way that it stays alive is the keepers of the knowledge and the wisdom have to have incredible memories. And the students have to be the selected few that also have the capability of being able to record, remember, and speak exactly what they were taught. And that is a very difficult thing to do, as compared to, I think in some ways we're degenerating because we don't have to really remember anything anymore. It's, we can record everything, and in that way, it's, it makes us, and even when you notice all these people who do so-called text messaging, they're taking the English language and breaking it down into little tiny pieces. So in that way, who knows what the English language will look like 100 years from now, because of people reducing the meaning and the size of the words.
That's right. Vocabulary is shrinking. PMSL, lol. Basically. Yeah. As far as the sort of symbolism, or is there anything that's particular to the Paracas that you've found? Because I haven't come across this in any of your videos. Is there any kind of symbolism or belief system that you can actually find in any of the artifacts?
Well, one problem is that Paracas artifacts are very small in number compared to Inca or Nazca, for example. And so in that way, Paracas artifacts are incredibly valuable. And most of them are probably secretly in private collections, being kept because they're of their high dollar or monetary value. But the basic theme of the Paracas ceramics is tranquility, peace, and happiness, because almost all of the animals and human figures that are on the ceramics are all shown with this huge smile on their faces, which would intimate that they were, I would think, a happy, peaceful people. But then when you have the next culture that moves in, who are the Nazca, you have incredible scenes of violence. You have graphic depictions of decapitation with blood flowing out of the neck, people with spears killing each other. I'm not aware of one Paracas artifact that specifically was a weapon of war. You find things like arrowheads and hammers and axes, but they could easily have been used for hunting and house building as compared to necessarily, whacking someone on the head. And my growing theory is that the Nazca people moved into the Paracas area and wiped out the elongated skull higher levels of the Paracas people, because in the archaeological record, elongated skulls in the Nazca period disappear, and the red hair also begins to rapidly disappear as well, replaced by normal-looking people with black hair. It's a clear chronological distinction.
Yes, well, thanks a lot, Brien. It's always fascinating to hear this, and it looks like the Paracas were an ancient civilization, were very advanced, and it's great that you're putting together all of this information and trying to come up with some kind of bigger picture. So thanks for all your work. I recommend that everybody goes to hiddenincatours.com and checks out your YouTube channel, and we'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you very much, Mark. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.